Greetings, welcome back to my channel. This is a bonus video on the notion of the 10x coder. In summary, while there are coders or programmers that are much more efficient than others, the notion of a 10x coder is really much more of a myth than a reality. And part of that myth is that the ultimate goal is to be a 10x programmer, and that there is a very narrow definition of what that 10x programmer is. To give you an idea, I think people look at it as someone that can basically churn out 10 times the code of somebody else. And it's really not much more of a nuanced view of it than that. But even that on the face is obviously not what we're talking about. It's very easy to type out 10,000 lines of stuff that isn't really good at all. And that's not nearly as useful as someone who writes 500 lines that are very useful. So it is obviously not about the lines of code. And so the question can arise, well, what does define software productivity? And guess what? After 40 plus years of research, we still really don't know what that looks like. We really do not have a good way of measuring that until after the fact. Basically, until there's a certain amount of code that you can actually run some metrics against, you can't tell if someone's going to be very productive or not. Not only that, but there have been some studies that show that while there's some predictability in a team from doing one project to another, it's not nearly as much as you would expect. Now, some teams do well on one project, can be moved to another type of project, and will do much worse. And so that is kind of a very frustrating aspect for people that are trying to study software productivity, is that it is really variable. And it really does vary on put them in one environment that changes completely, given the different type of topic or domain they're kind of trying to come up with solutions in. That will change everything. Some people, you switch languages on them, they don't care. Other teams, that will destroy their productivity. And so, given the fact that we don't really have good metrics on how to measure software productivity before we can look at, say, hey, this code base does have this many lines of code. We've run it for long enough that we know it has about these many defects. And you can say, oh, well, defects per line is pretty good, and these are the types of defects and so on and so forth. Then you can kind of measure it and say, oh, that was how, this is a fairly good code base. It seems to be working. It's successful. It's doing their job. That's very, that's basically post-mortem almost. It's almost after everything's done. And not only that, but it still doesn't measure if that code was made effectively or just by sheer brute force of just throwing resources after it one after another, or if it was really the product of one or two people just dragging it over the line, and they were the ones that the real superstars of the show, and everybody else was just kind of cleaning up behind them. It's really hard to tell. So given that, I want to get back to this notion of what you, as maybe if you're a junior watching this, how you can go about thinking about, well, what you want your career to be. And what I would say is that the amount of code you can generate and how fast you generate has zero to do with your success in the software space, right? Now, obviously, trivially, if you can't ever write any code, then you obviously can't do well. But in other aspects, there's a certain amount of, once you get to about a certain amount of proficiency, the amount of code you can do or how fast you can code really makes no difference at all. And in fact, I would say that for a lot of people that actually are very successful and more seniors, the amount of code that they do, has to decrease because of the other tasks that they've taken on. But two, they actually do a lot less rewriting than others. And so they actually make less mistakes and have to do less rewriting. That ultimately is the goal. And the thing about it is that if you look at AI, one of the things, which is a big topic right now, one of the things that fascinates me about the AI coding thing is that there's this assumption that what the most difficult thing about programming is coming up with the initial code. And that if you can solve that, you don't need junior developers. You can only have certain types of developers. Everything will be fast, because this AI will write these code segments for you much more quickly, and that will get you the state much more faster. Now, what they haven't done with these AI tools, some of them are looking at this, but a lot of them don't do very well on, okay, given a large code base or an existing code base, how do you make it better? They actually do much worse in those cases. Some of them can't do anything about it even at all. They literally just collapse under the size of this code and stuff like that. And so it ignores this basic fact about software development is that software development is editing, not initial writing. It is getting code into the form that it needs to be. And that means a lot of writing, editing, changing, doing all these types of things. It is not, oh my gosh, we just can't spit out 1,000 lines of CSS fast enough. That's never been the issue in the software industry. Never. Because basically it's one of those things where if it was, then basically we wouldn't need to edit code at all. You know, it'd be one of those things where it's like, well, you just write more and more and more and more of it. And eventually it'll take care of itself. So obviously editing is a big part of it. Not only that, but not writing the wrong thing and then trying to change it into something else is huge. Basically, in the initial part, knowing what kind of story you want to tell makes a big difference. It'll be one thing when it's like, oh, I want to write a small essay, and then you realize they're actually writing an entire, dictionary or almanac. That's a completely different project, and you don't want to go from, oh, this was a 10-page essay, and now it turns into this multi-volume epic. That's a real long process. Whereas if you want to write that big epic, you might want to do a little bit more stuff up front so that you can get through that faster. So when someone says, I want to be a 10x coder, and if they tell you, if they say, well, I really see myself as a 10x coder, no one who really is a 10x coder will ever say that. But certainly it's one of those things where the hardest part about it is that when you run into somebody who thinks they're a 10x programmer, and they are, but at the cost of making everybody worse. And that is actually more common than programmers that are also really skilled, but also make the people around them much better. There are a lot of prima donnas in programming teams that are excellent coders by themselves, can really do things and really understand things very well, but whose overall attitude for people that don't know as much of them or have different opinions from them really drags teams down. And here's the thing. I'm not going to say that I haven't been one of those people. I often worry in my career that I have been. One of those things that does come up is that my level of education obviously brings a big set of divide for these types of projects. It's tough to go into a project with people and say, hi, I'm a peer, when they find out you have a doctorate in computer science. And the first thing they think of is like, oh, you're one of my professors. And that's a hard thing to overcome when it's like, well, yes, I have that degree, but no, I'm doing practical programming for other types of reasons. And certainly that's been, for me personally, was a drag on my career. And of course, I won't discuss why I'm not in academia, because that's mainly, there's personal reasons that aren't too relevant. But when I was working on contracts or working on programming jobs after I finished my PhD, it was one of those things where that did kind of come up. And it was not necessarily all my fault. I think it's one of those things where a lot of people kind of had it out for me because they felt the necessary to basically show that they needed to prove something or wanted to up me and all that kind of stuff. And that is very unfortunate. But certainly is one of those things where I strive to do is I strive to actually be one of the programmers that helped other people out. And that is a lot more difficult than it has ever been before. And the reason being is that there's this singular obsession with creating an initial a product. And that comes from startup culture, which is basically, proof of concept, first type of thing. Got to get it out of the door as fast as possible. And that is a mindset that works on certain types of things when you need to get certain type of investment. But ultimately, that's not the vast majority of the work that you're going to be doing. And having that, kind of mindset will actually sometimes, it explains, one, why so many startups fail, because they don't feel like they have the ability to do the right thing in a reasonable timeline. It's one of those things where a lot of startups are the ones that got lucky with that process, that they had someone with a vision and could actually manage to execute it rather rapidly. That is not the common case at all. And the vast majority of programming that you're going to be doing is, again, editing existing large code bases, working on types of things. And it might not be fun or interesting or cool when we talk about the coding types of things. It would be one of the things where it's like you might not get to use the tools that you want or the programming languages that you want, all that kind of stuff. Now, that being said, there are some limits, I would say, to any programming environment that basically tells people exactly what editors they have to use. That's too far. There are certain things where you have to let an individual programmer give them some level of how they want to write the thing that they can do. And if they're getting that code in, which is text, ultimately at the end of the day, if they're getting it in and it's good quality and it's being checked into source control through Git, it doesn't matter what editor they're using. Now, there are more complex projects where that becomes much more of a difficult argument. For example, if you're doing traditional .NET programming, you could do it outside of Visual Studio, but you're making your life a lot more difficult. And so you might ultimately just have to bite the bullet and, like I did in my career, become a fan of Visual Studio. And when you add in ReSharper, just makes that a very lovely, if old school, combination. So, but basically it's one of those things where if someone tells you you can't use VS Code because you have to use Vim, or vice versa, that is something that's just not acceptable, because at the end of the day, it's like, there's some certain fundamental tools that you as a programmer have to be trusted to use. And an editor is not the table saw that can take your finger off. It's literally the screwdriver, which you have to use all the time, but it's not going to be dangerous if you misuse it, as if it was even possible to misuse it. So, okay, that's a bit of a tangent, but it goes back to this idea that basically there's lots of different ways that people can be productive as a software engineer. And the ones that we see as like 10X can often be the ones that have burnt more bridges and burnt more people out than you would expect. And you don't see that. You only see the success. You don't see the failures along the way. And so when you look at people that have been very successful, you don't see the incredible struggles that they've gone through. And as a junior programmer, that can be very disheartening. Now, combine that in with the current round of layoffs. And there is something that I can be completely sympathetic with, because I underwent a large layoff during the first .com expansion and then bust. I was at a company, 15,000 people got laid off from the company. And at that point, it's worse because it's not personal. It's not even about your performance. It's just about the fact that you, in my case, literally the way they did this is like, I made this much and it had only been there so long, therefore I was the best person to cut. That's exactly what they did. There's so many people that they went through that they thought it was impossible to go through role by role and say, hey, this person actually does have a future with the company, versus just doing the, last in, first out type of thing. And then just looking at your cutoff and saying, well, you know what? You were here, you've only got a couple years experience, but you're making too much money. And so that's it. And so that's just terrible. And it really is disheartening. And from a mental health aspect, it actually does have real impact. This making it increasingly difficult to find a job in a field that requires quite a bit of dedication to do is maddening. And you have to be able to take care of yourself. And not only that, but the most important thing, and I would tell anybody that did this, is that there are other ways to pivot. When you really find yourself up against a wall, or you find yourself that, oh, I really like this, or I thought I liked this, but it turns out I really don't, this is miserable. There are other professions out there. There are other ways of making money. And the great thing about computer science is that it actually is a really good place to pivot into other fields in, because computers are everywhere. And so you can take that experience and say, well, I started here, but now I'm really passionate about this, because at its core, computer science is about solving problems. And you can go off and say, well, I want to solve problems, but I want to use a different tool set. And not only that, but that can be super rewarding. For example, working in healthcare, a lot of people would never consider this, but there's a really great careers, and it's not awesome, super .tech money, but you can make a very good career as a nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, medical assistant. And, or, if you're really kind of motivated, it's one of those things where if you have a computer science degree, do a little extra work and you can get into med school and you can become a doctor if you wanted. And that has its own set of stresses and that type of thing. But it's one of the things where the demand is always going to be there. And not only that, but the rewards are huge. There's certain types of doctors, which basically you're making an impact on people's lives every single day. And that's awesome. And so, again, there is only not one way to not only just be a coder, but just to make yourself be productive and find a good career. So keep your eyes more open and don't beat yourself up if you have to take other jobs in the meantime to get where you need to go. It happens. And so lastly, I want to just re-emphasize what I think makes a really, what I call a 10x coder, has nothing to do with the code that how much code that they write or the kind of the code that they write, but what they inspire other people around them to do. And if you can do that as a junior, you can do it as a mid-level, you can do it as a senior, and there's nothing that stops you from being a better team player right away. And the hard part is that you have to just get through some of those bumps in terms of interviews and coding and things like that. And I will give you one trick that I found with coding interviews, that if you are brave enough to do this in the environment that we currently have in terms of hiring, go for it. If you're not, I completely understand. But basically, when given an esoteric type of problem and you try to do the basics of going through it and you're not getting a lot of help, the best thing you can do is go, well, I want to know what you're trying to learn here and how this relates to what I'm going to be doing in the job that I'm looking to get hired for and what you do at this company. And you'd be surprised at A, how many people can't answer that, but B, how that resets them and it gets back that discussion back to, okay, let's talk about what I, as the person that's interviewing for this job, bring to the table and what you need versus this artificial conversation about some, face it, worst case scenario, that something that they grabbed off Elite Code and think is one of those things where this is the magic type of thing where one day someone will cast a spell in front of them and prove that, boom, they are a programmer, bum, 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 and they shall be the one for the job. So if you are getting the interviews, I think that's the best way to go around it, is that do try to solve the problems, try to engage and talk out loud and do all those things. Just don't say, oh, show that you actually try to do the programming, do the types of stuff. But if you think that you're getting into the weeds and the esoterica and you're not going to get out of it, then cut your way through them and ask them, what does it have to do with what I'm doing here? So anyway, hope this is a bit more inspiring for some of the people out there that are looking for work. And if you are also working out there, maybe that'll inspire you to be a little bit more of a mentor for those that are working around you. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying the channel. If you are, like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.